Hey, friend, before we dive in, quick question, have you ever felt like the quietest person in the room might actually know the most? Good. Tonight's story is full of them. You're about to slip behind velvet curtains and heavy doors into war rooms, palace halls, and code-breaking offices where history thundered. But women whispered. It's easy to imagine history being shaped by loud voices, commanders yelling across battlefields, kings slamming fists on tables, generals barking orders. But sometimes, the most critical decisions came after a glance, a murmur, or even just silence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a chamber far from the front lines. A fire crackles low. The scent of beeswax and parchment hangs thick in the air. Men in armor pace or argue around a long, scarred table. On it, there's a map sprawling and smudged, marked with colored pins and smeared ink. It's all very dramatic. And at the edge of the room, barely in view, she sits. No one introduces her. No one even acknowledges her presence. But she's there, always. You might think she's a servant, maybe a secretary, perhaps the general's niece, sitting quietly as men do their serious work. But tonight, you're watching her, not them. She pours tea with steady hands. Her eyes flick from map to mouth, from gesture to grimace. Every small reaction from these men. She files away. And when they pause for breath, arguing over terrain or tactics, she steps forward with a fresh pot and a quiet comment that, somehow, just happens to solve the deadlock. No one congratulates her. One of the men might even grunt and pretend the idea was his. But the course of war just shifted, and she knows it. Throughout history, women like her have watched wars unfold not from horseback or trenches, but from the periphery, yet still shape the tide. In royal courts, in monastic scriptoria, in back rooms of parliaments and military councils. They've listened so well, in fact, that their silence became a weapon sharper than steel. Let's take you to ancient China for a moment. The court of the Han dynasty hums with politics. Here, imperial concubines aren't just romantic figures, they're power players. Ban Zhao, a Confucian scholar and historian, wasn't in the war room, but her writings educated the men who were. Her lessons for women was read not just as moral guidance, but as strategic insight on managing families, alliances, even political rebellion. Mainstream fact, absolutely. But here's the twist. Some scholars argue her work was laced with coded dissent, quietly critiquing the state while appearing submissive. Historians still debate whether she was truly conservative or cleverly subversive. Across the globe, in another time, you might have stood in the shadows of Versailles. While the Sun King basked in his own glory, his spies were busy, and not all of them were men. Female couriers and salon hostesses passed, whispered notes sewn into dresses or tucked behind fans. Imagine leaning in during one of those lush banquets and hearing not gossip, but war strategies in code. There's something strangely universal about these scenes. Whether it's a tent in a desert, a castle in winter, or a smoky London drawing room, there's always one woman quietly present. Sometimes a nurse, sometimes a clerk, sometimes a queen, but always watching, and always underestimated. One lesser-known example comes from the court of the Mughal Empire. Emperor Akbar famously kept a council of advisors, but behind those meetings, his mother, Hamida Banu Begum, advised him privately. She had the emperor's ear and used it. While the council made noise, she made sure diplomacy remained intact with Persia. and likely prevented an outright war over territorial disputes. It wasn't written into the official record, but the timing suspiciously perfect. And here's something you might not know. Napoleon Bonaparte's sister, Elisa, governed Tuscany during his campaigns. She established military hospitals and restructured local governance. She wasn't just a placeholder. She managed civil defense and redirected funds toward the war effort. Not bad for someone dismissed in most textbooks as just family. You walk past these echoes now. The corridors you follow are silent, save for the occasional rustle of a skirt or the whisper of slippers across marble. You start to feel like history has two layers, the loud one told in books, and the soft one that hummed just behind closed doors. Here's a fun bit during the Cold War. Some wives of UEs and Soviet diplomats became informal observers and influencers. While their husbands met in high-stakes summits, they noticed patterns, nervous habits, drinking preferences, who glanced too often at what page. Their social notes, passed through back channels, affected real decisions. One such wife reportedly noticed a Soviet aide fidgeting during discussions of nuclear policy, and that tiny signal shaped an entire week of negotiation strategy. Fringe, maybe. But would you bet against it? Still, historians argue whether these accounts amount to real influence or romantic myth-making. And you know what? That's part of the charm. This silent watch, this echo of presence behind the war room doors, it's intentionally hard to prove. That's how it survived. You end the night watching a room slowly empty. The map is rolled up. The candles burn low. The men leave, tired, congratulating each other. And the woman, she stays behind, adjusting a pin on the map just slightly before blowing out the final light. She'll be there again tomorrow. You're standing at the edge of a parchment-strewn table, its surface rough from years of elbows, ink spills, and the occasional knife jabbed in for emphasis. Across the room, a tall cabinet creaks open, and from it, she pulls out a long scroll, its edges curled. The ink faded just enough to make it seem ancient, but not irrelevant. She smooths it out on the table with quiet precision, her fingers gentle, like she's tucking in a child. She's not in uniform, no medals on her chest, no rank to speak of, and yet everyone in this tent pauses when she speaks. You wouldn't expect a woman to command attention in a medieval war camp, but here she is, tucked into the story of a kingdom you've likely never studied, her name recorded only in the corner of a single dusty manuscript. She doesn't fight with swords. She reads terrain like a novel. She sketches the land not as something to conquer, but as a living thing, something to work with, not against. She is a map maker, a silent empress of lines and angles. In the court of Byzantine Emperor Justinian, women were rarely seen in the war council. But Empress Theodora, his wife, was an exception. She was not only his confidant, but often his co-ruler. There are surviving accounts suggesting she had a hand in advising during the Nika riots and the Persian campaigns. Historians still argue whether her influence extended into battlefield tactics, but the debate itself hints at just how far her shadow stretched across those political war tables. Back to your mapmaker. Her name doesn't matter. It's been lost, replaced by a footnote or mistranslation. But what she's doing now that matters. She's drawing new topography, not from rumors or soldiers' reports, but from walking the land herself, under cover of dusk, with a loyal horse and a boy carrying a pack of inks and charcoals. She rides the ridgelines, listens to farmers, and counts paces between oak trees and broken stone walls. One night, she hears a distant owl, then silence. The kind of silence that means someone's watching. Her fingers twitch for the knife hidden in her boot, but she doesn't stop walking. Later, back at camp, she marks a new route, one that bypasses a likely ambush. all because of a missing bird song. Fringe, maybe, or just hyper-awareness born from years of being the only one who must notice the little things. She brings the map to the war room. The generals scoff. One makes a snide comment about ladies' drawings. She doesn't flinch, just lets them argue while the Emperor watches her sketch a mountain pass that isn't even on their records. When they take her path and win a battle with almost no bloodshed, no one credits the map. They call it good fortune. Let's fast forward. During the Napoleonic Wars, a noble woman named Countess Walewska, once known primarily for her affair with Napoleon, is believed to have passed coded notes hidden in embroidered handkerchiefs, messages based on information gleaned from watching the Emperor's battlefield maps during intimate moments. Historians debate whether she acted independently or under the influence of Polish nationalists seeking to manipulate Napoleon into supporting their cause. Either way, she had eyes on the plans long before most generals did. So much for pillow talk being unimportant. You watch our map maker kneel on a carpeted floor now, redrawing a coastline with her hair tied back and ink stains on her sleeves. She leans so close to her sketch that the candlelight dances across her lashes. She's adding faint dotted lines that suggest rising tides, an unpredictable threat most commanders ignore. Not her. She's watched the sea creep forward one tide too many. Her tent is quiet, but her mind isn't. She calculates distances in her head like poetry, feels elevation in her knees from a single ride. She carries not just ink, but instinct. You know that scene in every war movie where someone saves the day by knowing the land. Yeah, that's her. Here's something quirky for you. Some medieval map makers included illustrations of mythical beasts and sea monsters, not for decoration, but to mark territory they didn't trust. Our map maker does something similar. Instead of monsters, she draws small patterns, dots, circles, a sprig of leaves to mark spaces that feel off. No one else knows what they mean. But one day, when an entire regiment is rerouted to avoid a symbolic sprig, they survive a flood that drowns their enemies. Coincidence? Maybe. But the commander asks her to draw on all the new maps after that. Still, she remains unnamed. And while her maps end up in glass cabinets in future museums, no one ever says this route saved thousands, drawn by a woman who walked barefoot to measure every bend. No one writes that part down. One day, as she's sketching a ridge, a young squire leans over and says, "You know, I think you're better than all of them." She smiles, doesn't respond, just hands him a compass and says, "Draw a circle around that hill. It's going to be important someday." Later, that hill becomes the site of an armistice, when two tired armies finally stop to talk instead of fight. Probably just coincidence again. Right. You start to notice that in these stories, maps aren't just tools, they're stories. And the women who draw them are the authors no one names. They don't get statues. They don't get songs. But their silence leaves trails through timelines of ink that lead armies away from disaster and toward uneasy peace. And still, the war room never says thank you. She doesn't need them to. She's too busy redrawing tomorrow. It starts with a needle. Not a sword, not a cannon, just a needle, sliding in and out of velvet, silk, or wool, depending on the season, the nation, and the budget for flags this year. You're watching a woman in a low-lit room. Her fingers are pricked and calloused, the pads hardened from years of embroidery. Around her, scraps of fabric lie draped over chairs and wooden frames. At a glance, it all looks decorative banners stitched with lions, stags, dragons, or the ever-reliable eagle. But if you were to run your fingers over them slowly, you'd feel something unusual beneath the thread-raced seams, not part of the design. She's not just making art. She's stitching war plans. It's a subtle rebellion, elegant and bold, and so quiet that even the guards standing nearby wouldn't suspect a thing. You move closer, watching her work. The embroidery is lovely at first glance, just heraldic animals and floral borders. But then you notice the curve of the eagle's wing matches the curve of a nearby river. The placement of its talons aligns with key fortresses. The lion's tail curls in the exact direction an army would need to march to flank an unsuspecting city. This, you realize, is no accident. You've landed in the 15th century, in the court of Burgundy. Women of noble rank were expected to occupy their hands with sewing, especially when political guests visited. It made them look passive, harmless. And yet, some of these tapestries later appeared in military archives, marked as strategic models. Historians still argue whether these stitchers were trained informants or simply clever observers inserting their views. Either way, that embroidery wasn't just ornamental, it was operational. Here's a mainstream nugget Mary Queen of Scots, while imprisoned, famously embroidered messages with hidden meanings. In one panel, she included a phoenix rising from flames, interpreted by some as a coded reference to her claim to the throne. Some fringe historians believe she used knots and spacing to indicate letters, forming rudimentary cipher systems right under her captors' noses. Now back to our present stitcher. She's part of a small circle. You see them gathering occasionally under the guise of mending garments or preparing wedding linens. Each one brings a project, and within it, their own coded element. One woman is stitching a seemingly random vine that curls unpredictably across fabric. But you notice it follows a path very similar to a known merchant route, one used often for moving troops unnoticed. The youngest of them has been adding tiny imperfections into her work, mismatched petals on a rose, or a slightly altered shield crest. She giggles when others don't notice, but then points them out in a hush. "Watch," she says. "When this flag flies, the right person will know the real message." Still think embroidery is just a hobby. Even centuries later, similar tricks reappear. During the American Civil War, women in the South sometimes stitched coded messages into quilts, which were then hung outside homes. Specific patterns indicated safe houses or danger ahead, part of what's theorized to be a textile-based signaling system aiding escaped slaves and rebel couriers. Mainstream historians hesitate to confirm all these claims, but there's enough overlap in stories to raise eyebrows and interest. You're watching a woman now preparing a gift, an embroidered doublet for a visiting dignitary. She's asked to include the crest of the noble house, of course, and does so with meticulous care. But she also adds a single gold thread, looping down the side of the jacket, which, when followed on a map, outlines the border of a disputed territory. She knows the diplomat will wear it publicly, and she knows who will be watching. Of course, not all messages are tactical. Some are emotional. You find one piece stitched late into the night, a delicate handkerchief bearing a simple line of poetry hidden inside the border's lace. Return, not to fire. But to me, a general finds it weeks later in the folds of his coat and turns his army away from a doomed winter siege. Whether it was love or luck, no one knows. But the siege never happens, and no one ever knew why. You turn, and now the woman is showing a child how to thread a needle. "One stitch for truth, one for silence," she says. The girl giggles, repeating the words. You realize they're not just teaching craft, they're teaching memory. These threads are history lines too. Soft records, rebellious whispers disguised as homemaking. Want a quirky detail? In parts of Eastern Europe, certain embroidery motifs were considered protective geometric patterns believed to ward off evil or misfortune. Some women adapted these designs into military banners, believing they would shield soldiers. While modern scholars chalk it up to superstition, A few fringe voices suggest these patterns also served as identity codes in multicultural armies, helping prevent friendly fire in chaotic skirmishes. Imagine surviving battle because someone recognized a particular zigzag on your tunic. You smile. History is wild sometimes. Back in our quiet room, the fire has burned low. The women are packing up their work. One rolls a tapestry so carefully it's like she's cradling a newborn. Another folds cloth into a pouch, whispering something as she tucks it into her bodice. Before they leave, one pins a finished patch onto a larger banner that hangs above the hearth. At a glance, it looks decorative gold and crimson, with twisting ivy. But if you were to count the ivy leaves, they match the number of troops stationed at a nearby fort, and the exact placement of thorns. Well, that's something only the right pair of eyes would understand. As the women walk away, laughter echoing faintly behind them, you can't help but marvel. These weren't just passive observers. They were tacticians, record keepers, message carriers. And they stitched themselves into history, not for fame, but for function. So next time you see a piece of embroidery behind glass at a museum, look a little closer. That vine might be a river, that flower a fortress. And that border of repeating diamonds could be the road home. It smells like smoke and horses. You can taste iron in the air, blood or rust. You can't tell which. You're trudging alongside a caravan that creaks and moans under its own weight. No banners fly here. No fanfare greets them. These aren't warriors. These are women. And they're marching with the army. But not to fight. Not officially. You glance around. There's a woman in her 40s balancing a swaddled newborn in one arm and a sack of herbs in the other. Another sharp-eyed girl, no older than 15, checks the wheels of a supply cart, then tightens a splint on a soldier's leg without being asked. Further back, two more help hoist a makeshift stretcher over a muddy trench, muttering about how men always pretend they're not dying until they try to stand. These women aren't here for glory. They're here because war has a nasty habit of involving everyone, whether invited or not. And someone has to pick up the pieces. In ancient Rome, camp followers were a common sight. These were not just wives or companions, they were cooks, laundresses, nurses, and yes, midwives. The army didn't pay them. In fact, Roman generals often tried to keep them at a distance, but they came anyway. Why? Because when your husband is gone for years, your choices are wait, starve, or follow. Many chose the third. You're walking now beside one of them, a midwife from a dusty hill town. She has hands like bark and eyes that don't blink when things go wrong. She's delivered babies in fields soaked with blood and soot. She's seen soldiers beg for their mothers, then go silent and still. She keeps moving. Tonight, she's on her 6th mile of the day, tracking a young woman with labor pains who shouldn't even be her. Camp boy's girl. Someone says under their breath, didn't know until too late. The midwife nods, grabs her pouch, and disappears into a tangle of tents. Hours later, she reemerges holding a healthy newborn wrapped in her shawl. The mother sleeps behind her, breathing slow and even. No one claps, but the entire company walks a little straighter the next day. Here's a curious historical nugget in the 17th century, 30 Years' War. Field midwives were sometimes employed not just for childbirth, but to treat wounds. Why? Because they knew anatomy. More than most surgeons, actually. They knew where to cut and where not to. One woman, Anna Maria Wehinger, was rumored to have amputated limbs cleaner and faster than the military doctors, and taught her techniques to others using dolls carved from firewood. Quirky, sure, but in a world where leeches were still considered medical technology, she was decades ahead. You pause beside another midwife as she rinses her hands in a cold stream. Blood flakes from her nails. She's humming soft and tuneless, and it somehow makes the moment more haunting. When you ask her how she does it, she shrugs. We don't have the luxury of breaking down. Later that evening, a young scout returns, breathless. He carries something small in his hand, a scrap of fabric embroidered with a faint symbol, a warning. A rival army has changed course. The midwives gather, squint at the stitching, and nod. One of them pulls out a map. Yes, she has a map and begins to chart a new route, carefully avoiding the road that's about to be a killing ground. You realize, suddenly, that this isn't just about healing. These women are moving information, quietly, constantly. One scholar's theory, never quite mainstream, suggests that in several medieval European campaigns, midwives operated as informal messengers, trusted by both sides. Why? Because neither army wanted to risk harming someone who might deliver their children. So midwives passed borders unnoticed, unsearched, with a coded lullaby or disguised salve that said more than any scroll. And you better believe they use that. You notice one woman rubbing a salve onto a soldier's arm, his skin blistered, his eyes glassy. It smells oddly sweet. Too sweet. Sleep, she murmurs, as he slumps into unconsciousness. You've talked enough for one day. A few yards away, another woman tucks a letter into her apron, its wax seal still warm. To the commander, she says, as if it's nothing. Even now, historians can't agree on how much of this was deliberate intelligence work and how much was survival improvisation. Did the midwives really coordinate, or were they just working miracles with whatever came their way? It doesn't really matter, because the result is the same. Wars were won and lost, not just by the ones who held the swords, but by those who knew where to place the basin, how to stop the bleeding, and when to whisper a warning instead of a prayer. There's a strange peace in watching them now. In the middle of a world on fire, these women make space for something else. Life, continuity, secrets. They protect it all, not with armor, but with aprons, poultices, and a kind of weary grace that no battlefield anthem could ever capture. The baby born last night, he won't remember this place. But one day, if he's lucky, he'll hear a lullaby and feel safe, without knowing why. And somewhere, someone will smile because that lullaby was written during a siege by a woman who didn't think anyone would ever hear it. You follow the midwives as they move on. One laughs, another carries the baby, a third adjusts the pack mule's strap. It's all quiet, practiced, unseen. But make no mistake, they are the invisible artery keeping this war alive and maybe keeping peace just barely in reach. It's a chilly dusk when you step into the candlelit corner of a makeshift tent, where pages of parchment rustle like dry leaves and the scent of wax and ink hangs heavy in the air. A woman hunched over a writing desk doesn't look up. She's rereading a letter. Her lips move slightly, forming the words in silence. She's memorizing it. Then, in one clean motion, she tears it to shreds. Because this letter was never meant for you, nor for the man it's addressed to. Not really. It was meant to be intercepted. You're now among the quietest corridors of history, the kind where communication becomes camouflage, and the voices of women carry across borders, not in speeches, but in letters. From ancient Egypt to World War II, the art of correspondence has always had its champions. But women, they mastered the nuance, the between the lines. And while war made many men heroes, it made many women writers. Not poets or authors, although plenty of those too, but correspondents in every sense of the word. Take this stack of parchment in front of you. They're bound with twine, smudged at the corners. The handwriting changes with each one, some scrawled in haste, others in elegant loops, but the tone, it's remarkably consistent. Coded, careful, devastatingly clever. Here's one addressed to my sweetheart across the sea. And at first glance, it's a love letter. But then you notice the curious use of seasons. I miss you in the spring, when the snow won't melt. Why mention snow? The town she's in hasn't seen snow in years. And further down, I long to walk again by the river that no longer sings. A cipher, maybe a location. Historians still argue whether these lines were poetic or strategic. What we do know is that messages like these shape diplomacy in ways cannons never could. In the 12th century, Eleanor of Aquitaine, yes, the Duchess, Queen, and all-around legend used letters to quietly coordinate alliances during her separation from Henry II. She was imprisoned for years, yet the network of correspondence between her and her sons and their enemies remained suspiciously active. While some letters survive, others were destroyed on purpose, and the ones that remain, they're more veiled than velvet. Our woman here isn't royal. She's a scribe for the Queen's lady-in-waiting. Technically, she's supposed to copy dictated correspondence, but she often edits it ever so slightly. That phrase about hunting dogs becomes one about border patrols. A line about a dinner guest includes a subtle jab at a military delay. If read by a friend, it's harmless. If read by a spy, it becomes an accusation. And then there are the tears. Some letters were written to be cried on. Literally. Emotional ink. The kind of heartfelt plea that could influence a noble's conscience better than bribes ever could. In 18th century Prussia, several court wives exchanged teary letters full of domestic woes that conveniently contained enough strategic gossip to destabilize a trade agreement. Were they emotional manipulators or accidental informants? No one agrees. But the agreement fell apart a week later. You pull out another letter. This one is short. 5 lines. No verbs. It's essentially a list: roses, 3 fields, the ox, the hill, the lantern. Sounds poetic, but turn it upside down, and it matches a farmer's inventory list. A common trick during wartime combines civilian records with code to avoid suspicion. Quirky tidbit. During Kamu, some British women in the resistance wrote secret messages on their underwear stitched into the lining in Morse code. These messages were passed along like whispers, never lasting more than a day. The undergarments burned after one use. One woman reportedly sewed the entire layout of a train station into the hem of her slip using only dots and dashes. You chuckle. Try explaining that in a museum. Our letter writer tonight folds a fresh sheet carefully, creasing it once, twice, then sliding it into a sleeve. She doesn't seal it. She hands it to a girl barefoot, soot on her cheeks, who tucks it beneath her scarf and vanishes into the night. Who was that, you ask? No one, the woman replies. And she's right. Sometimes, the messenger's safest when she's invisible. Letters were also tools of emotional warfare. In feudal Japan, some wives of samurai warriors were instructed to write farewell poems, delicate, painful things to be delivered if their husbands fell in battle. But a few used these farewells as weapons. One wrote, "My heart does not await you, but my hand holds your shame." He survived the battle, retired quietly the following year. Historians debate whether that poem was the reason. You're beginning to see a pattern. These aren't just letters. They're chess pieces, confessions, ultimatums, sometimes love, sometimes lies. All of them shaped by women who knew they would never be remembered for writing them but wrote them anyway. In the corner of the tent, a fire dies low. The last letters are burned. A few are copied. One is eaten. Yes, chewed and swallowed with a grimace. It's not even dramatic, just efficient. Paper doesn't digest well, but it doesn't betray you either. One woman chuckles as she shuffles a deck of blank parchment, holding them like cards. "You can't unsend a sword," she murmurs, "but a letter, well, that can disappear." As you leave the tent, you notice a stack of sealed notes resting on a saddlebag, each one tied with a ribbon that signals a different destination. None of the names are real. All of the meanings are. And somewhere, someone is about to make a decision based on a sentence that was never supposed to reach them. You turn your collar up against the breeze. The wind tonight carries whispers, some meant for you. Most not. You're in a dim hallway, now stone walls, damp with English rain, and the muffled clatter of heels on marble echoing through the corridors. But the real noise, it hums behind a closed door at the far end, where rows of fingers tap away at typewriters faster than thunder. You ease the door open. Inside, the air buzzes. No war cries here, no clanging swords or barking commanders. Just dozens of young women hunched over machines, eyes darting across endless streams of letters and numbers. Some mouths move silently, calculating, decoding. Others scribble on notepads, crunching logic puzzles no one taught them in school. Their uniforms are plain, their importance immeasurable. Welcome to Bletchley Park, and to the unspoken realm of the silent decoders. It's 1942. World War II rages across continents. But you're watching a woman named Joan, 21 years old, fresh out of university. Her gift pattern recognition, her curse. She can never talk about it. She was recruited in a quiet interview that never mentioned what she'd be doing. Just vague references to important clerical work and national duty. What she actually signed up for: breaking Nazi codes with the precision of a chess master and the secrecy of a shadow. Mainstream fact. The Bletchley team was responsible for cracking the Enigma code, a feat that likely shortened the war by 2 to 4 years. While Alan Turing gets most of the headlines, and deservedly so, it was the thousands of women who kept the gears grinding day and night. Over 75% of Bletchley's workforce were women, not assistants, not just secretaries. Mathematicians, linguists, puzzle solvers, giants. You walk behind Joan as she stares at a sequence of gibberish XBY 238 Myke. Zoo. Her pencil taps, then circles something. Zoo, she whispers. Isn't that a known code for convoy? She rushes to a colleague, a woman with horn-rimmed glasses and a smudge of ink on her cheek. If zoo is convoy, then maybe Mick means northbound. And suddenly, a clue blooms. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet, brilliant deduction. Here's a fringe tidbit that might make you grin. One woman at Bletchley, Mavis Beatty, cracked an Italian naval code while walking her dog. She had been mulling over a set of ciphered messages for days. The pattern clicked during a morning stroll, and she rushed back to confirm it. The result, British forces intercepted and won a key battle off Cape Matapan, because a 20-something linguist couldn't stop thinking about numbers even while scooping poop. You pass a break room where a few women sip tea. No one mentions what they're working on. They talk about the weather, a book, a cat. But under the table, one taps a rhythm with her fingers. Morse. Trouble with the rotor again, another asks, without looking. The first one nods slightly. That's how they communicate. Even in rest, their brains are working, their minds like humming wires, stretched taut. It wasn't glamorous. Long shifts, constant repetition, and rules. So many rules. No talking about your work. Not to family, not to friends, not even to your roommate, who might be working the same job from a different angle. Historians still argue whether the total secrecy was entirely necessary, but it worked. Bletchley remained one of the best-kept secrets of the war until decades later. You sit next to Joan as she pores over a fresh sheet. The message is full of repeated characters, something rare in Enigma code. Her breath hitches. "It's a mistake," she whispers. "Someone sent it sloppily." That mistake tiny, human becomes a foothold. Within hours, they've intercepted a message about submarine movement in the North Atlantic. Dozens of merchant ships reroute quietly. No one sings, no one celebrates, but lives are saved. And no one will know. When the war ends, Joan and the others pack up their desks. Some letters are burned, some notes swallowed, literally. One woman folds a code sheet into her teacup and drinks it down like a bad remedy. Their work is done but not rewarded. Most are told to keep quiet for life. No medals, no monuments. Just a firm handshake and a reminder this never happened. You pause by a corkboard near the door. On it are photos of young women, some smiling, others serious. Each one has a nickname scribbled underneath the poet. Lightning, Miss Rules, Clocks. No real names, no ranks. But behind each face, a mind that helped stop a war. Quirky fact. Some women grew so good at predicting code behavior that they began finishing each other's patterns out loud mid-sentence. One duo, known among their peers as the twins, despite being unrelated, once cracked a week's worth of messages over breakfast. Without a single scratch of paper, their supervisor called them a miracle in petticoats. Later, in a quiet interview room, a man from the government offers Joan a new job, something administrative. She declines. "I've had enough secrets," she says. Instead, she becomes a teacher. No one knows what she did during the war, not even her husband. When she dies, her family finds a box labeled recipes filled with neatly folded cipher notes, code charts, and a single photograph of her at Bletchley. On the back, she's written, "We kept the world turning." And they did. You step outside into the drizzle. The brick buildings fade behind you, but their hum stays in your bones. You've just witnessed genius wrapped in quietness, heroism dressed in modest skirts and messy buns. No parades, no glory, just thousands of women typing, decoding, solving while history marched on, thinking it was the only one in charge. But now you know better. Behind every intercepted message, there was a Joan, and 100 more like her. It's late. The kind of late where silence thickens and the oil in the lantern turns amber. You're in a narrow tower room, stone walls, uneven floor, and a small window carved so deeply into the wall it feels like peeking through the past. There's a woman bent over a desk, quill in hand, parchment spread before her, but she's not copying scripture or court records. No, she's writing war. Not speeches, not strategy memos. Propaganda. Welcome to the hidden chambers of persuasion, where women have always shaped the story, especially when the war didn't go their way. This woman's name might be Alice, or maybe not. She lives in 14th century France during the 100 Years' War. Her task: compose a message of faith and fortitude to be distributed among local clergy. Her real goal: quietly rally a town to resist English control without making it look like treason. So she writes in allegory: a noble lion threatened by shadowy jackals, a faithful shepherdess protecting her flock from wolves. Standard churchy stuff, until you realize each animal lines up suspiciously well with known military actors. The lion, Charles the Dauphin. The jackals, the Plantagenets. And the wolves, well, the wolves always change, don't they? This was one of many ways women nudged the minds of the people through words wrapped in parable and prayer. And the practice didn't stop there. In World War I, British women formed the Women's War Propaganda Committee, distributing posters, essays, and speeches to galvanize morale. Some wrote pamphlets, others ran newsletters for soldiers, filled with homey anecdotes and uplifting tales that never quite matched the mud and meat grinder of the trenches. But they worked. Morale mattered. And if the boys believed they were heroes in the making, they fought like it. Now back to our scribe. She's finished her latest piece and hands it to a boy barely tall enough to reach the saddle. He tucks the scroll into his tunic and disappears into the night. Will they believe it, you ask? They'll believe what they need to, she says, if the story's strong enough. Across centuries and continents, women have wielded that same quiet pen. In ancient Mesopotamia, temple priestesses composed hymns to the gods, some of which later influenced royal edicts and military codes. Historians still argue whether those divine poems were written for worship or control, but either way, the line between spirituality and strategy blurred under their quills. Let's jump to the American Civil War for a moment. In the Confederacy, a newspaper writer known as Miss Arabelle wrote columns disguised as etiquette advice. But if you read closely, the paragraphs were structured to spell out troop positions, the fifth word of each sentence, the first letter of every paragraph code within code. She was arrested twice, released both times, just a lady with opinions, the officers said. Right. Quirky little side note. In revolutionary France, one noblewoman reportedly distributed hand-painted playing cards with Jacobin slogans printed beneath the face cards. The King of Hearts said, "Beware those who love too easily. The Queen of Spades' power lies in quiet hands." Officials confiscated them by the dozens. People kept playing anyway. You watch our tower scribe prepare ink from ground walnut shells. She adds vinegar, a pinch of salt. The ink dries invisible. Only lemon juice will reveal it. On a separate scroll, she writes a harmless poem about birds. On another, a recipe for fig compote. Harmless until heated. Then the message blooms. Even in the 20th century, women used the written word to do more than inspire, they sabotaged. One French resistance courier wrote letters to her cousin that included sentences like, "I hope the rain doesn't flood the cellar again," which was code for their storing munitions near the wine barrels. She baked some into loaves of bread. If the bread came back uneaten, the message got through. If not, well, she adjusted the recipe. Back in our tower, the woman lowers her quill and exhales. She looks tired, the kind of tired that comes from convincing people not just to act, but to believe. Because if wars are won with weapons, peace is earned with narrative. And it's harder to win minds than it is to wound bodies. She rolls up the final scroll, ties it with blue thread, and places it under a loose floorboard. "That one's not ready yet," she says, almost to herself. "That one needs the right moment." You step back, suddenly aware of the weight of every speech, every slogan, every rousing tale of heroism. They didn't just come from generals. They came from women like her, from tiny rooms where ink was ammunition and stories were siege weapons. One scroll here claims a nobleman died heroically. In truth, he tripped over his own sword and drowned in a duck pond. But that's not the story the people need. He rode into battle for the freedom of France. It reads, "And the peasants weep and donate grain and march." The truth, flexible, useful, sometimes gently edited for morale. And yet, sometimes the lie preserves more than just dignity. Sometimes it builds a bridge to a future where peace seems possible. Because once the fighting stops, the stories remain. And whoever writes them shapes what people remember. It's almost silent, except for the creak of wooden steps and the faint drip of rain from a gutter above. You're underground now beneath a city, perhaps, or maybe a monastery long forgotten by the war outside. The air smells of stone and damp parchment. A lantern flickers ahead. There she is, cloaked in grey, hood drawn, holding a small wooden box close to her chest. You barely hear her whisper, "Hurry," before she pushes open a hidden door behind a shelf of dusty prayer books. Inside, rows of shelves lean under the weight of bound scrolls and fragile pages. At first glance, it's a library. But this is a vault of memory, and she's the keeper. Most people think wars are all about force guns, arrows, fire, but they forget about records, lists, names, borders, proof. Because once the dust settles, it's the documents that decide who owns what, who lives where, and who has the right to speak. And women, they've often been the ones preserving that proof quietly, stubbornly, long after the generals have gone home. You follow her deeper. She kneels by a stack of ledgers. "These are the names of every family in the valley," she murmurs. "If the town is burned, these will still exist, so the people won't vanish with the smoke." It hits you this isn't just paperwork, it's resistance. Back in 13th century Japan, Buddhist nuns kept detailed census rolls during a period of civil unrest, listing not just the living, but the dead. These rolls became vital decades later when land disputes erupted. "This family has lived here since the time of the nuns," they'd say, and somehow that meant something. Historians still argue whether the nuns were acting under imperial orders or protecting their own. Either way, they safeguarded memory, and memory is power. You glance to your left, a stack of bound journals, each one labeled only by season: spring 1441, winter 1442. Inside, records of food shortages, troop movements, marriages, births, and quietly tucked between lines, a note strangers passed by with black boots. "We fed them to avoid harm." That's not gossip. That's a snapshot, a receipt of survival. In 19th century Liberia, missionary women, both black and white, maintained correspondence that later became the only documentation of local uprisings, peace agreements, and backdoor diplomacy. Quirky, isn't it? These letters were meant for sisters and congregations across the sea, but now they form one of the only consistent records of what happened when pens outlasted bullets. Our archivist today, she moves like she's rehearsed it 1,000 times. She hides bundles of scrolls behind bricks, under tiles, even beneath a loose step. When you ask how she knows where they all are, she smirks. "Because I wrote it down." She taps her temple. "Here." Even her memory is a kind of vault. Later, she guides you to a sealed box carved with symbols. "These," she says, "are the letters they didn't want you to read." She opens the lid. Inside, correspondence between two rival dukes, marked confidential but now copied in her precise hand. "Proof of betrayal," she says, "but I'm saving it until it's needed." And suddenly, you understand. This is her war. Not of weapons, but of witnessing. You pull out a page, a list of names. Beside each, a date. Executed for suspicion of treason. It reads, but beneath that, in faint script, no trial, no proof, all denied. She had gone back and corrected the story. Not rewritten, just clarified. Because one day, someone will ask, and the truth will be ready. Want a strange side note? In 17th century Poland, women from noble houses often acted as family historians. They were expected to record births, deaths, illnesses, travel, and alliances. But some went further, documenting secret affairs, lost fortunes, even betrayals. Their journals, passed through generations, now offer historians one of the most complete records of that era. Not because they were ordered to, but because they knew someone had to remember. You watch our keeper roll up a scroll and slide it into a ceramic jar. "Clay doesn't burn like parchment," she says. "If the town falls, this might survive the fire." She hands you a brush. "Write something, anything, so your voice is here too." You hesitate. But then you write, "We were here." She smiles. That's always a good start. The war outside continues. You can hear distant thunder, maybe cannons, maybe just a storm. But in here, time feels slower, calmer, as if truth has a chance to breathe. She blows out the lantern. Before you leave, she presses a folded paper into your hand. "Don't read it now," she says. "Wait until it matters." And then she disappears down a hallway lined with the weight of everything the world tried to forget. You walk away, heart a little heavier, but strangely steadier. Because now you know. Peace isn't just built on treaties. It's built on receipts. The sea wind hits your face the moment you step onto the weathered dock. It carries salt, spray, and something sharper. The crack of sails being hoisted, the low thump of crates unloaded. You watch men shout over gulls, boots thudding across planks, while below the din, a woman stands quietly by a rope coil, her arms crossed. You wouldn't notice her unless you were looking, which is precisely the point. She blends in here bare feet, sun-darkened skin, hands calloused from a life that doesn't pause. But she's not just helping offload oranges or mend netting. She's watching, counting, not the fish, not the barrels, the ships. Because this port isn't just moving cargo, it's moving information. And she's the one keeping track. Welcome to the world of dockside intelligence, where women often overlooked, often underestimated, ran some of the quietest, most efficient spy networks history forgot to mention. You trail behind her through the bustle of a 17th century Mediterranean harbor. A ship bearing a Spanish flag anchors beside a Dutch vessel. Smugglers, traders, and military envoys mingle freely, because no one polices everything. But she does. Quietly. Precisely. Her name might be Isabetta, or Fatima, or Jeanne. She speaks 3 languages, knows 5 currencies, and can spot a ship from half a mile by the angle of its sails. She also knows which captain is late, whose ship unloaded too quickly, and which barrels have never been tapped, despite being labeled wine. Historians still argue whether women like her worked independently or were linked in loose collectives, sharing signs and signals across ports. One fringe theory suggests they used knitting patterns, stitching flags with subtle imperfections to signal incoming threats or goods of interest. Is it proven? Not really. But enough records mention needle signs and dropped lace to raise a few academic eyebrows. You see her now tapping her fingers against a crate, slow, rhythmic. A boy across the docks scratches his neck in return. That's it. Message received. She moves on. Mainstream history rarely highlights these kinds of operatives, but there are records. During the Napoleonic Wars, British port towns like Portsmouth and Plymouth employed local women as tide watchers. Officially, they were to report unusual ship activity. Unofficially, many were better than the actual officers. One woman, known only as Old Ness, predicted a French fleet's maneuver 3 days before the Navy confirmed it. Her secret. They loaded biscuits before cannonballs. She said they weren't going to fight. They were going to feed someone. Back in our port, Isabetta leans against a post, seemingly idle. but you watch her eyes scan a manifest, the ink smudged deliberately. You suspect. She catches the name of a nobleman who shouldn't be in this part of the world, then watches the crate labeled olive oil move off the ship with too much care. She says nothing, but she follows it. Down an alleyway. She trades a single word with a laundress, who nods. By nightfall, a coded message will be sewn into a kerchief and tossed into a basket heading inland. No one checks the laundry, especially not the embroidered part. Want a quirky side story? In colonial-era Vietnam, female fishmongers in river towns were known to keep oral ledgers not just for goods sold, but for suspicious faces, unusual purchases, and altered river traffic. French officials thought it quaint, until a tax shipment vanished and one fishmonger recited exactly who passed the dock that day, what they wore, and what songs they hummed. The shipment was found. So was the spy. Guess who caught him? Yep, the fishmonger. You move with Isabetta now as she slips into a tavern. Inside, smoke curls from clay pipes. A group of sailors laugh too loudly over dice. She passes the bar without ordering and taps twice on a barrel. It sounds hollow. She notes it. Later, she'll send that note by pigeon, a single strip of cloth, knotted once for Navy, twice for West, and a third time for wounded. The note will reach a nun in a monastery 3 valleys away. She'll whisper it to a shepherd, who'll etch it on the underside of a sheep's hoof with wax. That sheep will cross a border by morning. Sound ridiculous? Maybe. But wars have been lost for less. You follow Isabetta back to her shack above the docks. Inside, her journal lies open, written in code only she understands. Not numbers, not symbols, smells. Cinnamon, saka, safe. Must bar, suspicious. Brine, svar, reroute. One entry simply reads, salt with musk, nach fire coming. She closes the book. You ask her how she knows who to trust. She shrugs. You don't. You just watch longer than anyone else. And you believe her. Because while the men chart the sea with compasses and maps, she charts it with memory and intuition. No medals, no pension, but every safe arrival has her shadow behind it. As the sun dips, casting long amber light across the waves, she stands on the dock again. Same place, same stillness, just watching. Because sometimes the best way to survive a war is to see it coming. You're standing in a narrow garden, half wild with lavender and thyme. Bees hum lazily between the stalks. From the outside, it looks like nothing more than a kitchen plot. Quiet, fragrant, simple. But you're not fooled. Because underneath this little Eden, a revolution is brewing in mortar and pestle. The woman kneeling by the herbs is old enough to be your grandmother, but there's nothing frail about her. Her hands are stained green, her apron smudged with powder, and her eyes glint like someone who's survived more winters than she'll admit. She picks leaves with precision, muttering under her breath. You're in the middle of a medicinal intelligence hub. In times of war, when supply chains crumble and apothecaries vanish, someone still has to keep the soldiers breathing. And more often than not, it's women like her herbalists, healers, hedge witches if you're feeling medieval, who step in to do what trained doctors either couldn't, wouldn't, or didn't dare. She plucks a sprig of horehound and snaps it clean. Good for lungs, she mutters. Burn it to keep the plague from settling. You nod like you understand. But you don't. Not yet. Because this isn't just healing. It's information. It's networks. It's resistance with roots. Back in ancient Persia, women in temple households cultivated extensive herbal knowledge, often passed through matrilineal lines. Their gardens were more than sanctuaries, they were pharmacies. fortresses, and memory banks. Historians still argue whether these women were officially part of the state medical system or operated outside it, but in records, their names appear again and again beside terms like remedy, breath, and, curiously, map. That's because plants were used as code. This old woman, she once sent a bundle of yarrow wrapped in nettle leaves. To the untrained eye, it was a harmless gift. To her ally, it meant, do not enter. You'll be stung. A fringe tidbit. In 16th century Scotland, an accused witch named Isabel Godey described using herb bundles to communicate safe passage routes. Birch for yes, blackthorn for no, she said during her trial. The court scoffed. Centuries later, folklore experts found similar symbols etched into walking sticks and cottage doors. You follow her into a cramped cottage filled with shelves of drying leaves, jars of tincture, and books that look too worn to open. She pours you a cup of something bitter. For your nerves, she says. War gets louder when your hands shake. You sip. It tastes like regret and roots. On the wall hangs a calendar, but it doesn't mark saints or harvests. Instead, it marks moon cycles, troop movements, and illness outbreaks in 3 neighboring villages. Every color-coded dot-A decision made. This is when they ran. This is when they stayed. This is when they died. You're beginning to understand she isn't just healing wounds. She's tracking them. And adapting. In Unarmed, France, the resistance relied heavily on wise women, rural healers who could stitch a gut wound with horsehair and boil foxglove into life-saving heart medicine. They weren't doctors, but they had something just as valuable, trust. People believed them, which meant they could gather whispers, pass messages, hide fugitives under the guise of rest cures. You glance around. In this room, even the tea feels like a trapdoor. She begins to grind something in a mortar, ginger, honey, clove, and something dark and bitter. For the boys with cough, she says. Then, softer, the one who limps won't make it through the month. She's already preparing for the funeral. You watch her slip a note into the lining of a pouch. They came through the North Trail. Supplies low. She seals it with wax and herbs. Smells like medicine. She shrugs. Nobody ever opens it. Wants something odd. In Eastern Europe, there's a record from 1811 of a woman who encoded messages in bread-baking garlic clove formations that mimicked a local cipher. She delivered the bread to a monastery every Tuesday. No one questioned her. But decades later, a monk's diary revealed he'd kept all the loaves and decoded every message. He called her the savior who fed both bodies and plans. You step back outside, the sun setting over her garden. She kneels again, placing a small rock beside a young rosemary bush. For the boy with the red hair, she says, almost to herself. He'll need to know where his brother is buried. You don't ask how she knows. You just listen. Because in her silence, there is no doubt, no flinching, just steady hands and a memory like bark weathered, rough, rooted deep. Her plants will keep healing long after the soldiers leave. Her records will remain tucked in baskets, stitched into sachets, buried in root cellars where no fire can reach. She's never picked up a sword, but she's outlived plenty who did. And if peace ever truly returns, you can bet it'll find its way back here first to this wild garden where war has passed, but never truly won. You're somewhere colder now. Not snowbound, but the kind of cold that clings to stone walls and seeps up through your boots. The floor trembles faintly with movement, and the stale scent of dust and damp wool hangs in the air. You're in a basement. No windows. just flickering candlelight and rows of shelves stacked with ledgers. No, not ledgers. Clothes. Hundreds of uniforms, carefully folded, tagged, altered, and at the center of it all, a woman threading a needle. Her fingers move with astonishing speed, not frantic, not showy, just practiced. Calm. You blink, and in the time it takes to notice her gray-streaked braid, she's already hemmed a tunic and tucked something tiny, maybe a slip of parchment, into the lining. You've entered the hidden seamstress's quarters, where fabric isn't just fabric. It's camouflage, concealment, and a way to carry truth without being caught. There's a strange silence here. Not heavy, not ominous, just focused. The whir of treadle sewing machines in the background, the snip of shears, the rustle of cloth. They're not making ball gowns or quilts. They're altering uniforms, reinforcing boots, and hiding secrets in seams. You pick up a jacket, looks ordinary, smells faintly of tobacco and horse. But run your fingers beneath the armpit, and you find it a small patch of mismatched fabric. Behind it, a rolled message, waterproofed in waxed linen. It's labeled only with a dot and a cross. Historians still argue whether this system originated with Polish resistance groups or earlier Balkan rebel networks. What's clear is this: women sewing in supply rooms were often doing far more than logistics. They were the couriers, the information brokers, the tailors of subversion. And it worked. In 1940s Italy, underground networks called staffette relied on seamstresses to carry microfilm bullet maps and code phrases stitched into uniform cuffs. Many were never caught. The trick, the better the stitching, the less likely a soldier or a spy would bother checking. "Your seamstress tonight?" She doesn't talk much, just hums a tune while reinforcing a belt. "This one walks heavy," she says, measuring the leather. "Likes to stamp his feet. He'll need double stitching." She's not just tailoring fit, she's tailoring perception. Because appearance in war is another kind of language. A quirky detail. During the 1860s in America, enslaved women often used quilting as covert communication. One popular theory, still debated, suggests that certain patterns in quilts like the log cabin or flying geese signaled safe houses or directions along the Underground Railroad. While hard evidence is scarce, oral histories persist. And either way, the act of turning domesticity into navigation genius. The seamstress lifts a pair of gloves. "He's left-handed," she mutters, adjusting the seam for wear, and he sweats when he lies. You raise an eyebrow. She shrugs. You get good at reading things when you iron their secrets. Later, she opens a drawer filled with swatches. Each is labeled in code flower names, but not for color. Lily means safe to pass. Marigold means underwatch. Poppy, well, that one's not good news. Every courier who passes through her room leaves with one swatch sewn into the lining of their clothing. No one questions it. It's just a patch, a detail, until it saves your life. In another corner of the room, a younger girl, maybe 15, works on boots. She's inserting something under the sole. Not a knife, not poison, just a thin strip of paper. You catch a glimpse: names, locations, a shift schedule. When you ask where it's going, she simply replies, "East." That's all you get, and that's all you need. In 20th century Vietnam, women in tailoring cooperatives were known to transport ammunition in bolts of fabric, threaded to look like loom stiffener. The supplies moved through checkpoints disguised as trade goods. One report even notes an entire disassembled rifle carried across 2 provinces in the hem of a ceremonial robe. You run your fingers along a navy sash, hidden between folds. there's a silk-wrapped needle, a fallback signal. If the wearer is captured, she's to break the sash. The flash of silk means burn the archive. Leave no trace. This is what quiet looks like. Not timid, not soft, just deliberate, surgical. The seamstress pauses only once during her work, when folding a tunic with a small tear at the shoulder. She presses the fabric to her cheek and sighs. "He won't be back for it," she says. She still folds it, though, still labels it, still places it neatly on the shelf. You ask her why. She doesn't look up, because someone will want to know he was real. And you realize this room isn't just function, it's memorial. It's archive. It's all the things a battle report will never say. The sewing machine creaks again. Another thread begins. Another piece of war hidden in plain sight between stitches and sighs. You're in a kitchen now, or what passes for one rough counters, rusted pans, and the low orange glow of a fire struggling against the damp. The smell of onions and damp wool hangs in the air. But underneath that, something sharper. Gunpowder, earth, blood, but faint, masked, hidden behind the stew. The woman at the hearth doesn't stop stirring when you enter. Her back is straight, her sleeves rolled up, and her eyes flick briefly toward you before returning to the bubbling pot. "You hungry?" she asks. You are. But that's not what you came for. This kitchen is a mask. The stew is a signal. And she's the last checkpoint before people vanish or survive. Welcome to the war kitchens, less about cooking, more about covering, smuggling, listening, organizing, one meal at a time. You sit at the table and listen to the rhythmic scrape of her spoon. She hums a tune, not for you, but for the boy in the next room. A lullaby, soft and off-key. The same one her mother sang when the bombs fell 2 wars ago. You glance around walls lined with preserved goods, cupboards filled with flour and dried herbs. But look closer. In the flour sack, a pistol. Behind the spice jars, rolled mats. And beneath the floorboards, a trapdoor. She sees your eyes flick toward it and nods slightly. "Bread rises better when it's warm down there," she says. You're not sure if it's a joke or code. Probably both. Mainstream fact. In World War II, especially in occupied countries like the Netherlands, Poland, and France, countless women used domestic roles as shields, hiding resistance fighters, feeding rebels, and gathering intelligence under the guise of running households. Historians estimate that in some areas, over 70% of underground operations had women in primary logistical roles, many centered around the kitchen. The fringe tidbit. In 1943, a woman in Prague was discovered smuggling enemy documents inside meat pies, literally baked into the filling encrypted on edible rice paper. Her code name was Sage. When interrogated, she reportedly said, "They were the most well-seasoned secrets I ever made." Back to your cook. She ladles stew into a wooden bowl, sets it in front of you. It smells normal, safe. But you notice the garnish a single sprig of rosemary, not parsley, not thyme, just rosemary. The boy in the next room stands up, walks outside. That was the signal. Someone's waiting in the alley. Her hands never stop moving. She washes, she chops, she checks the fire. You ask if it's always this subtle. She raises an eyebrow. You think we're going to hang a sign that says, "Rebels welcome, secrets inside." She points to the hearth. This fire's burned through 5 governments. It'll burn through 1 more. You look again at the shelf beside her. Each jar labeled by contents: dried beans, barley, lentils. But the jars are in the wrong order. When aligned properly, The first letter of each spells out, "Send no one new." She can rearrange them in under 30 seconds, depending on who comes to the door. She pulls a loaf of bread from the oven, slices into it. Inside, pressed deep in the middle, a folded scrap of cloth, red thread on white. You don't ask what it means. She doesn't offer. Historians still argue whether women like her should be classified as operatives or civilians. After all, they weren't in uniform. They didn't carry weapons. But without them, lines of communication collapsed. Safe houses failed. Fighters starved. Some say their kitchens were the real command posts. You peer under the table. Etched into the underside of the wood dates, coordinates, names. Visitors, she says, shrugging. Not everyone leaves through the front door. Quirky fact in Ottoman era. Balkans. Some women wove entire escape plans into rug patterns. A red zigzag might mean danger. A break in the weave, a safe tunnel. One rug, discovered in a monastery attic in the 1900s, reportedly detailed a 4-day escape route sewn by a woman named Nura, who also served as the abbey's cook. Our cook now. She flips a kettle lid, inspects the bottom. There's a charcoal mark there, a triangle. Faint. They cross the river. She mutters. Good. Then, as if nothing happened, she adds salt to the stew. A boy bursts in through the back door, mud to his knees. She says nothing, just hands him a clean shirt and pulls his wet boots off. He's shaking. She wraps his feet in towels, hands him soup. You made it, she says simply. He nods. You ask how many she's helped. She doesn't answer, just gestures toward the wall where wooden cooking spoons hang from nails. There are 13 spoons. You guess there used to be more. You sit for a moment longer, watching her cut bread, stir soup, tend to this fragile, fiercely orchestrated illusion of normal. Because this quiet, rhythmic survival is her way of waging war, no medals, no rank, just warmth in the cold, a signal in the stew, and a back door that stays unlocked. In a world gone loud with guns and speeches, she fights with silence and starch. And still, she wins. It's night now, and the fireflies have replaced the lanterns. You're standing on the edge of a clearing just beyond the reach of firelight, where shadows move like whispered stories. In the center of the circle, women sit cross-legged on rough blankets. Their voices are low, hushed, deliberate. You've stumbled into the council beneath the stars. There's no table, no official robes, no seal of approval. But this is where decisions are made. Not by kings, not by commanders. By those who listen, who tally risks, who weigh cost against survival not just for armies, but for the people underneath them. This circle isn't new. It's old, ancient, and it has survived because it never needed permission to exist. One woman speaks, pointing to a crude map scratched in dirt with a stick. They'll come from the south, she says. We move the families north before the rains. Another shakes her head. The river's too high. They'll drown. They go back and forth, voices even. No shouting, no fear. Just planning. You recognize something ancient here, maybe something primal. Women have been making hard decisions in hushed groups for as long as stories have existed. Back in ancient Yoruba culture, the Iyaloda senior woman chosen for wisdom and community insight held political influence that rivaled male chiefs. Her council didn't bear swords, but it carried weight. She decided when to withhold crops, when to open homes, when to risk the community on a gamble for freedom. Historians still argue whether these roles were ceremonial or real authority. But the records, grain taxes, meeting logs, marriage approvals say plenty. Here in the circle, the decisions are just as real. A young woman named Myrna unrolls a crude census, families, numbers, ages. She circles 3 names. These are the only ones who know how to read the grain contracts. If they're taken, we lose everything. An older woman nods. We hide them in plain sight, assign them as cooks. A third woman says nothing but draws a triangle in the dirt. It matches the one you saw etched on the kitchen kettle. Everything's connected. Want something strange. In 12th century Mongolia, Genghis Khan's empire is often remembered for conquest, but behind the curtain, his daughters governed vast territories. Sorgagtani Beki, in particular, was known for her nightly councils, quiet gatherings with merchants, teachers, and midwives where trade routes were adjusted, famine plans drawn. Some say she ruled more wisely than her sons. Others say she taught them how. But what's clear? Power doesn't always announce itself. Back in the circle, one woman reaches into her cloak and lays down a polished stone. The others go quiet. It's a marker, a vote. The stone means yes. Within minutes, other stones follow, some smooth, some cracked, each one carrying weight that no decree from a palace ever could. When they're done, the oldest woman gathers them and places them in a cloth pouch. We'll move by dawn, she says. There's no applause, no flourish, just a sigh, a small one, but filled with relief. You ask what they're moving for, people. Supplies, hope, one woman says flatly. That's always the most fragile thing. You notice someone sketching the night sky with her finger. She's memorizing the stars, not for poetry, but for navigation. The mountain looks different from that side, she says. But this one always points home. She taps a spot above the trees. If we lose everything, look for that one. The North Star has guided ships and slaves alike. But here, it's a lifeline shared among women who may not get to meet again. Quirky detail. In 18th century Iceland, women would meet under the pretense of knitting groups. They did knit gloves, scarves, socks, but they also decided how to ration fish during famines, arranged secret adoptions, and resolved disputes without male intervention. Their meeting notes, hidden in plain sight, stitched into patterns, rhythms, and stitch counts. Here in the clearing, someone begins to sing, softly, a lullaby in a language you don't know. Others join in. It's not for celebration. It's a ritual, a way to seal decisions, a way to ground what comes next. And in that song, you hear something enormous. Not victory, but continuity. Because while others strategize for conquest, this circle strategizes for survival, for carrying culture forward, for keeping names alive even after the graves are lost. One of the women hands you a bundle of cloth. You'll take this to the ridge, she says. You nod, even though you don't yet know what's inside. She looks at you for a moment, then says quietly, if they catch you, say it's nothing. Say your mother made it. Then she's gone, melted back into the night like mist. And you're left standing under the stars, holding a bundle stitched shut with red thread, the weight of 1,000 decisions humming in your hands. You're inside now. A monastery, or maybe just the shell of one quiet halls, swallowed by moss and memory. The ceiling arches like the ribs of some ancient beast. There's a draft coming through the broken stained glass windows, and every footstep feels like it echoes across centuries. You follow the sound of chalk on stone. In the far chamber, a woman kneels at a slate board no bigger than a tabletop, her fingers white with dust. Around her, a half-circle of children, barely old enough to count on both hands, trace letters with sticks on the floor. This isn't a school, It's a firewall. Because when war tears through the land, burning libraries and silencing teachers, someone still has to carry the knowledge. And often, that someone is a woman with chalk-stained hands and eyes that never leave the door. You sit quietly and watch as she teaches the children a rhyme. It's a list of kings, but as she repeats it, you realize it's not the right order, and the names are wrong. Wait, they're not kings at all. They're places. And the rhyme, it's a map. She's disguising geography as poetry, revolution as recitation, because the words that survive, those are the ones no one suspects. Back in the 15th century, during the Hussite rebellions in Bohemia, women in cloistered communities used psalms to encode troop warnings. Line breaks, pauses, and altered syllables marked routes and safe houses. Historians still argue whether the nuns were part of the movement or simply protecting their flock. Either way, they left behind psalters with marginal notes that don't match any religious calendar. Here, your teacher, let's call her Mireille, sets down her chalk. She begins teaching numbers now, but not like you learned them. Each digit links to a place, a symbol, a face. It's math with memories stitched into it. A 6 isn't just a 6, it's the 6th bridge, the 6th soldier, the 6th child who never came back. This isn't a curriculum. It's a ledger of loss disguised as learning. Want a strange historical footnote? During colonial rule in Algeria, French authorities banned Arabic language education. In response, women began teaching children in secret using cooking sessions, embroidery patterns, and lullabies. A scarf's stitches translated to Arabic letters. A cookie recipe mirrored grammatical structures. When caught, they said they were just keeping the kids occupied. They weren't. They were keeping a language alive. Mireille picks up a scrap of parchment worn, folded a dozen times. She shows it to a girl no older than 7. "This is the story of your grandmother," she says. She walked 2 days with this under her tongue. The parchment contains 3 lines, a quote, a date, a single name. She passes it to the girl, who repeats it softly until she knows it by heart. Then Mireille burns it. Ash falls like snow. No trace, no proof, just memory passed from mouth to mouth, as it has been for millennia. You want to ask how many stories she's burned, but you already know the answer. You look around and notice drawings pinned to the far wall. They look like Doodle's flowers, animals, stars. But look closer. The stars are arranged in constellations that don't match the night sky. The animals represent regions, and the flowers. Each one marks a grave. There's a legend scratched behind the altar. It reads simply, "If they silence us, we'll speak in symbols." A boy coughs. Mireille hands him a cloth and resumes the lesson. She draws a circle in the dust. Inside it, she places a stone, then another beside it. 1 is alone, she says. 2 is a message. The children nod. You feel that sentence settle somewhere deep. These lessons aren't just survival. They're resistance. They're inheritance. In 10th century Korea, court ladies were often dismissed as decorative musicians, poets, seamstresses, but some were trained in secret as scholars, using poetry to record political dissent. One woman's calligraphy scroll, long thought to be a love poem, turned out to be a veiled critique of a failed land tax reform. It had been read aloud for generations without anyone noticing until someone did. Back in the monastery, Mireille claps twice. The lesson ends. The children rise, brush off their knees, and scatter. She sighs and leans back against the stone wall. You ask her why she teaches in secret, why she hides the truth in riddles. Her voice is tired, but sure, Because if we give them the whole truth, they'll tear it down. But if we give them pieces, and they hold on to each other, then someday the truth will reassemble itself. She begins erasing the slate board. Bit by bit, the chalk dust rises like smoke. Another class ends. Another generation carries the flame a little farther. And in the stillness, you realize this isn't just about facts. It's about remembering how to remember. Because even when the war comes crashing down, somewhere in a darkened room, a woman is teaching a child how to carry a country in a single sentence. There's a hallway, a long one, narrow, damp. Stone walls on either side, the ceiling low enough that you have to hunch, the kind of place meant for storage, or escape, or secrets. Your footsteps are muffled, swallowed by the passage. At the end, a faint glow flickers, candlelight maybe, or firelight. You follow it. The room you step into is round, high ceiling, domed with soot-stained plaster. It smells of smoke and old wax and ink. Around the edge of the room are chairs simple, wooden, and in them sit women, quietly working. Some are bent over desks, scribbling. Some thread string through tags. One is sealing a wax envelope. One is wiping ink off her fingers with a cloth that used to be white. This is the final stop. This is where the stories come to rest. You've entered a war archive, not the kind with tall stacks and typed reports. This one is made of testimony, scraps of it, eyewitnesses, fragmented memories, letters pulled from burned homes and whispered statements collected in crumbling corners of collapsing cities. And the women here, they're the keepers. Each one has chosen silence as her strength not to stay hidden, but to hold everything no one else can, what others call background. They call the frame. The woman nearest you is writing on paper that looks handmade. She's copying something from a scrap, an account of a missing child. Seen near a bridge at dusk. It's not dated. No one knows the outcome. But she writes it down anyway, because it matters. In the corner, another woman sharpens a reed pen and mends a spine of a half-burned journal. Each page she saves might be the only proof someone ever existed. You sit beside her, and she hands you a book. "Hold this," she says. It's heavier than it looks. You open it. It's a list. Names. Some scratched out. Some underlined. Some with notes beside them, gone to Sweden. Last seen in spring. Spoke 5 languages. Walked with a limp. Never stopped laughing. You realize you're holding not a document, but a ledger of souls. Mainstream history. Fact after World War II. Jewish women in displaced persons camps often took on the role of zikaron memory keepers. They documented names of the missing, collected testimonies, and wrote letters to government offices trying to reunite families. Some kept entire memory books for towns that no longer existed, maps, recipes, folk tales, surnames. Fragments saved the whole. Fringe tidbit. In early 20th century Armenia, a group of women survivors created a memory circle in Beirut. Once a year, they gathered to recite the names of everyone they'd lost, on no paper and no pen, just voice. One woman, known only as Naneh, reportedly remembered over 400 names until she died at 97. Back in the archive, a bell rings once soft, not urgent. One woman rises, crosses the room, and slides a new box onto the table. It contains a broken locket, a child's drawing, and a dried flower. No note, no explanation. She lifts each piece with care and begins a new record. You ask if she'll ever publish it. She looks at you, confused. "We're not here to publish," she says. "We're here to preserve." Then she adds, "Truth doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs somewhere to live." On the back wall hangs a tapestry, not fancy, not old, just wool, faded from smoke and time, but stitched into it, barely visible unless you know where to look, are hundreds of initials, some only 2 letters, some embroidered so faintly you'd miss them if you blinked. You run your fingers across it. It feels like holding on. A young girl enters. She's maybe 10, with ink-stained fingers and a shy smile. She carries a scrap of cloth wrapped around a lock of hair. From the northern village, she whispers. One of the women nods and takes it, gently unfolding the cloth and brushing away a leaf that had clung to it. There is no ceremony, only reverence. You help where you can, folding paper, stamping wax, arranging files in their protective sleeves. But mostly, you listen to the silence, to the work, to the deep, slow patience of women who've chosen to spend their days remembering the things history tries to forget. As the candlelight dims, one woman speaks softly. Some of them will never be found, she says. But they won't be lost, either. Not if we keep them here. And you believe her. Because in the quiet between the pages, in the soft hush of turned parchment and careful breath, there's something sacred and enduring. Because when the speeches fade, when the statues crumble and the medals rust, there will still be women in rooms like this, writing it down, so no one can say it didn't happen. The room grows darker now, and the work slows. The scratching of pens fades. The last candle burns low. Outside, the night stretches long and quiet. Cool air drifts through the cracked window, soft as a lullaby. You let your body relax. The weight of the stories gently pressing you down, not as a burden, but as a blanket. Heavy with memory, lined with truth. Think of the kitchens, the gardens, the libraries tucked in ruins, the hands that stitched resistance into hems and turned lullabies into maps. Think of the women whose names you'll never know, who bent their backs to shelter others, who taught in whispers and sewed in code. They didn't ask for fame. They asked to be remembered. And tonight you've walked behind war room doors and found not silence, but strength. Not absence, but action. And as you drift now into sleep, let the rhythm of their labor carry you. The murmur of secret councils under stars, the soft scrape of spoons and chalk, the hush of fabric folded with intent. Breathe in. Let it all settle inside you. Not just as history, but as legacy. Tomorrow, the world may roar again. But for now, there's only the quiet echo of courage and care wrapped gently around your thoughts. Like a hand resting lightly on your shoulder. You're safe. You're not alone. And in the silence, you sleep beside 1,000 watchful eyes who never stopped keeping the fire lit. End of script. Sweet dreams.